Hey everybody. In this video, I'm going to be going over a very quick summarization of my overall process that I usually do to develop, fantasy character illustrations, creature illustrations, whatever you might want to call them. I do have a much, much longer version, roughly about 8 to 9 hours or so of content available. I'll have a link to that down in the description below. But for those of you that don't want to spend 8 to 9 hours, that's right, I said 8 to 9 hours of pure quality golden content. You want your questions answered? You betcha I answer your questions, probably. But if you don't want to listen to me do all that, here's a much quicker version, and you're still going to see the whole process from start to finish, just at a sped up pace. So enjoy the video. So to start off, I start all of these characters with reference gathering. I'm going and looking at existing oozes that I've seen from other card games, other IPs, other artists, that have done stuff like this, and I'm just kind of trying to see, like, okay, how has this been handled before, and how could I maybe shake it up a little bit? Do I want to recreate the same kind of ooze? Do I want to go more classic? Do I want to do something different? And that's kind of what I'm thinking about at this point. And really, I don't have anything in mind. I have no clear plans, goals, anything. I'm purely just going off of gut instinct and what sounds really enjoyable to me right now. So looking at, like, even this is just like materials. I'm just looking at, what could be some interesting ways of handling the materials of this. And, like, I love going down these Pinterest rabbit holes, and you can see I'm starting to grab reference of, like, swamp witches and, like, skulls and water and, like, just eerie stuff. Like, it's not even stuff that's relevant to ooze directly. It's just stuff that I think is, like, creepy. And like, maybe there could be something there that I could kind of go off of. I got reference of honey because it's not exactly ooze, but it's a material that's, like, comparable. It's thick and gooey, and so maybe I could use that as a jumping off point. I've gathered reference of these skeletons and skulls and whatnot because, I'm starting to kind of get a little bit better of an idea of what I might want to do, just from looking at all these references and stuff. And I'm kind of thinking, like, okay, it'd be pretty cool if, like, this ooze, it digested people, or it's got bones and skeletons and stuff in it. That's, like, pretty classic ooze. And I wanted to get some other skeletons in there too, and try and figure out, like, oh, okay, maybe it has, like, some animals inside of it. There's, like, a snake skeleton I saw, so I thought, okay, that could be really, really neat. What would it be like if there was, like, a snake skeleton, or maybe it's somewhat constructed of a skeleton or something. So anything to just kind of get my brain going and thinking about things in a interesting way. And just having fun with it, just playing around with what looks or sounds cool to me. That's all this stage is meant to be. I can always gather more specific reference once I've figured it out, but this is just the fun exploration side. So now I'm actually taking one of the images that I found, and I'm starting to work on it and do a study of it. So I have a video about studying that was done years ago, and for the most part, I still study, in a similar fashion. I still definitely believe studying is one of the best ways of, or a very effective way of, like, learning, when you're trying to, figure something out specifically. And so the way that I study is, right now I'm recreating this image. I'm not super concerned about absolute accuracy. I'm not even concerned about, like, spending a ton of time. I think maybe this whole thing took me 30 minutes, 45 minutes, something like that in total. All I'm focused on is, what is this material that I'm copying? I grabbed this reference and did this material, or this version of the material, because it has caustics in it. And I'm not familiar with caustics. For those that don't know, caustics are that light refraction effect that's happening within. You can kind of see it on, like, the bottom portion of this material. I'm not as familiar with that. I'm not as familiar with translucent objects, and certainly not ones that cause that, like, caustic effect. And so I really wanted to make sure that I sat down and I explored this material and did a study of it. Um, and accuracy to me is not nearly as important as learning. You can do something completely inaccurately, but if you're learning fundamental aspects of it, that's what's important, because then you can take those and you can start to, keep that in your head, and kind of remind yourself of that next time you're working on this material. So that's why a lot of the times I will be taking notes. And you can see here that I'm taking notes of all sorts of stuff. I'm taking notes about what the colors are, the transition of colors and hues, because the material is shifting from like, a greenish blue at times to like a lime green and to yellow green. Like it's going kind of, through this like weird hue shifting that's happening. And I think that's really interesting. And that's something that I think is kind of important to consider when working on the material for this monster. Even if I don't end up doing green, that's something I could still recreate and think of on a fundamental level and think, okay, I probably want the hues to be shifting in this way. So that's something I could take, and even if I'm not directly applying this exact material to it, I'd still be able to learn something there and implement it later on in my work. And I'm taking notes of, highlight locations, what's happening with the caustics, what's happening with like the form as it starts to round out near the bottom. How do the ripples kind of, look as this thing is like being poured on the material? And so whatever seems relevant to me and something that I think is interesting, that's what I'm going to take note of. Sometimes it's taking notes of things that I've already learned in the past, but just need a nice reminder of. And I just think writing it down is a really good way of remembering that stuff. And you can see that I'm ending the study by recreating the material, but with my own object now. So I'm just making a basic ball, and I'm seeing, okay, can I recreate this material, but with my own shape, my own techniques, that I did on this study, and get like a similar result. And I think it went pretty decently, and I felt fairly confident going into the actual ooze monster itself and the rendering, and being able to create something that looked, somewhat oozy. So now I'm getting on to the initial exploration drawing stage. This is normally where I'd be doing tons of rough sketches. I think I was either lazy with this one or I just really liked this first sketch, but I was kind of into it. I liked the shapes and stuff. So I normally would do, on other characters, I've done anywhere from 5 to 20 sketches, just getting the right pose down or right idea down. And this guy just right away, I was really digging it. So I just went straight into it after this. But I always do my sketches like fairly rough, and you'll see here at some point I'm going to lower the opacity of the sketch. And that's about what I would consider as like a rough sketch. That's when I'd usually move off of that sketch and move on to another one. So usually each sketch takes me roughly, I don't know, something like 5 minutes or so, tops. Like I try to be really quick, really rough. Just get like a basic idea down, and then before I even have time to think, I jump on to the next one. And all I'm focusing on here is I'm focusing on what is the story, what's interesting or unique about this design, what's the cool idea here. And the idea that I had that I was really into was, okay, what if this is an ooze that's like an abomination or something, and it's combined with all these different skeletons, and then it uses those skeletons to like form its own anatomy. And so it's kind of got like, it's got extra arms, there's bones that are sticking out that aren't the correct bones, there's multiple rib cages, and it's just because this like amorphous blob didn't know the proper way of putting anatomy together that made sense. And so I even wanted it to seem like this cool ancient being that's been doing this forever. And so I gave it this skull that's not even like a real animal skull. I looked at other animal skulls and I purposefully made like a mix of like a hippo with like a couple other things, because I wanted it to just seem like it's not like normal. It's this very strange, uh, like abstract being. So you can see here, like I was saying, is that I lowered the opacity and I start working on a refined sketch. So what I'm doing here is, as I'm working on this, I'm making sure that if the idea is there, I'm happy with the idea, that now I have to set myself up for success on a technical level. So I need to make sure that the shapes are interesting and that everything fundamentally in its form and perspective are reading correctly. The only reason that I do this now is because it's just a lot easier, I think, to plan for this stuff sooner rather than later. Otherwise, I could be painting on top of this thing and adjusting things like crazy. And I do that. There's always going to be room for adjustment and things that need to be changed and shifted here and there. But it's a lot easier if I can find those flaws at this stage and start, building from there. And so figuring out, okay, what is the shape arrangement of these ribs, and, how are they related to the skulls, and what's the overall silhouette of this thing? And I found, over time, like, okay, the silhouette could use some areas that it could pop in a couple parts. So I add some spikes near the top. They're just like some, weird tusks or something. Just stuff to add a little bit more like visual interest to the outside. Um, and then the big thing, I think the hardest thing is that foreshortening, making sure that the perspective on everything feels like it feels right. And this was especially difficult with this because it is kind of an amorphous blob. Normally I'd have limbs like muscles intersecting with muscles and stuff through perspective, and it's almost like easier because I know that there's a shape that's meant to intersect with another shape. Um, and to me that's so key to faking perspective on something that's 2D. And so yeah, didn't have the luxury of that except with the bones and stuff in here. And so it was a little tricky, but I also gave myself a little bit of leeway with it because it is amorphous, so maybe it doesn't have to be exact. But yeah, so just basically setting myself up to have a smooth painting, ideally. And so you can see here, what I did is I lasso tooled the entire drawing and I blocked it in with a color. Um, and from here, I'm going directly into color. This isn't exactly common for everyone. Artists have there's all sorts of different techniques. Some people start from black and white, some people start directly in color. I tend to start directly in color. Um, and I tend to usually, whether this accidental or on purpose, I tend to start with a little bit more muted of colors. I usually don't have as much saturation, as much contrast in my values, and I tend to build that up over time, using like levels, adjustment layers, or just using like a color dodge layer to add a little extra contrast. But what I really wanted to do here is, while it was still fresh in my brain, I wanted to take what I learned from that study and start directly applying it onto this creature. And so it might look a little strange because everything right now looks very like matte. Everything's very smooth, and the material was very reflective, and you saw through and saw caustics from the light coming in. And the reason that I'm starting in this way is because I'm handling it like how I'd handle other materials. Because all materials tend to have a lot of similarities. Everything kind of falls in line with the form principle. If you follow me on Twitch, or if you ever heard me talk about painting or rendering at all, you've heard me say the form principle probably a dozen or hundreds of times. And I'm gonna try and make a video on that here very soon, going over exactly how that works. But materials all have similar things, that they're similar reactions to light. And so, two of those being glossiness and specularity are big ones. Glossiness is the sharpness of reflections, and specularity is the reflectiveness of the reflections, if that makes sense. And so I'd identify this like jelly material as high glossiness because the highlights are super sharp and crisp, but low specularity because it's not like chrome, right? Chrome is like the highest specularity you can get, where it's absolutely like mirror-like. You're seeing an exact reflection back at you. And it's taking those colors and reflecting those colors exactly back at you for the most part. The one unique thing about this material is that it's translucent. And so that will, shift how we perceive it. So it's going to get a little weird in areas that normally there'd be a cutoff between light and shadow. And that's something that I have to consider as I start to paint this up. And that's the biggest consideration, which is why I did a study for this. So, everything that I'm doing at the moment is just getting that basic structure in place, with the forms. I have a general idea of where's the direction of the light coming from. Where's the cutoff point? Like what's going into shadow? And it's a little unclear at the moment. I'm kind of fudging the light because there is no exact light source. This isn't in a scene, so I get to decide like, okay, is there ambient light? Is there colored light? What direction are these light sources coming from? And it's tricky because there isn't a scene, but also it is very freeing because it allows me to have this kind of fake lighting setup that this thing could exist in order to best pop it out against the background. And that's something that I care a lot about when I work on these characters. I do these characters as a side project, but also as stock art, and I sell it to other people for their other projects. And I don't know how these characters are going to be used in other projects. And so one thing that I want to consider is I want to make sure these characters can look good on any valued backdrop. I can't guarantee color. That's too many things to plan for, right? But I could make sure that if it's on a dark backdrop, it's still going to look good. If it's on a light backdrop, it's still going to look good. And if it's on a mid-tone backdrop, it's going to look good. So a lot of the times I have this mid-tone gray as the background to make sure that it's all going to still stand out and look all right in the end. So now that I have the basics of this form sort of painted in, like I was saying, I have the light and the shadow somewhat implied, at least for my main light source, which is lighting this whole thing, which is, this general ambient light coming from, somewhat of a upward front area, ambiguously behind a camera. Now I'm adding some of that contrast, which you can get away with this. I think when you have your light source somewhat blocked in and established, adding contrast, as long as your light source is, established well, adding contrast is just increasing the intensity between those two, between the light and the shadow. So I'm adding contrast, and now I'm starting to figure out where are these other light sources coming from, and I start to block that in. And you can see I've established two light sources outside of the general ambient light. I have a warm rim light that's very bright coming from the back right, and then I have a cooler kind of rim light coming in from the back left. And what I've tried to be very conscious of when I work on stuff like this is I try to make sure that there's no competing light sources. And what I mean by that is that I don't want both of these rim lights to either be the same color temperature or the same intensity. And so I'm making sure that as I block in these light sources that they're not, both super, super bright and super, super strong, because then it can really flatten the form. But if I have, the front ambient light be, pretty dim, and then I have a really strong rim light and then a somewhat strong rim light, then there's this nice variety and balance of light sources that kind of show the form in these different ways. And like I said, I want to make sure that there's different color temperatures. So the front light source is neutral, maybe leaning a little warm. And then the back right is definitely warm, and then the back left is definitely cool. And so it's just adding some of that. I don't know. It's what I would call, I guess, like dynamic lighting is how I think of it. And I get a lot of people that talk to me about rendering, and there's a lot of people that say they really enjoy my rendering, or they say I have really good rendering skills. And the thing that I guess is kind of weird about that is, for the most part, I don't think of things as rendering as much as everything is a reaction of light, and then there's texture on top of that. And so what I mean by that is everything I'm doing right now might look like, yes, I'm at the rendering stage, but all I'm really doing is I'm looking at these forms. I generally understand what the material is. But if I just start from a matte material, even, all I'm doing is thinking, okay, how is the light hitting this? What are the planes that are being affected by this light? And how much is it being affected by this light? Now, there's all sorts of other stuff that gets into it, how the colors will react, and, the values react to it. And then not only that, but, how to plan for the colors and the values to make sure that compositionally, as an image, it's still pleasing to the eye. So there's definitely a lot more that go into it. But generally speaking, when I'm starting to work on like a render, I don't think of it as a render as much as I'm defining where is the light and where is the shadow, and then everything else, is just added bits on top of that, right? When I think about color temperature, and I think about local color, and I think about the compositional use of the value in the color and all that. But rendering to me is really simple, because when you think of it in that way, And so that's what I'm doing here, pretty much for the majority of this. I'm thinking of everything just in, okay, is the light hitting this? Yes. Okay, how is it hitting it, or what is the material that it's hitting? So I know how to paint it or how to adjust it in this way. And then, it's not until pretty much the majority of it is blocked in with some sort of lighting that I then decide, okay, what is the texture? And so, near the end, I start to get, into the little ripples of the ooze or into the like the bone specifically. And that's when I really start to add in little bits of texture. And all the texture is, I have this major form of the skulls or the ooze blocked in with light, and all I'm doing is deciding like, okay, maybe there's a small little dent in the bone here, or maybe there's a little ripple in the ooze here, and I just paint that with light the same way that I was painting the larger forms. It's starting from these large forms and working down into these smaller and smaller decisions, until at the end I decided that it's good enough. And this is the final result for the ooze monster. So, thank you everyone for, sitting down and listening to this. I hope this was enough insight into the process, enough of like a crash course, I suppose, and in how I handle painting and how I handle designing these characters. And if you're interested at all, I've got a longer version. Like I said before at the beginning of the video, it's got more information. I answer tons of questions, and it's way, way longer. It's like I said, 8 to 10 hours, I think, is where it's currently clocked at. And so, if you're interested at all, I'll have a link to my Gumroad down in the description. But otherwise, feel free to ask questions in the comment section, and I'll try to help anyone out there that has any questions there. And I know that I don't come out with videos very often. I do have a plan on coming out with a couple more here actually soon. I swear it's actually going to happen. Um, and but then that might be it. I don't think I'm going to have much else to offer for YouTube. There's not much more that I know about painting or drawing that I feel like I could share with everybody. So if there's any other videos or content that you'd like to see from me, feel free to say something in the comments, and I'll consider it. But otherwise, I just appreciate everyone that has been watching my videos and subscribed, and I'm sorry that I take forever coming out with content like this. But I love you. Bye.